Welcome back. This is the Grant Caldwell Report, bringing you the latest breaking news of the hour. A sharp claim out of Venezuela is reigniting one of the most contentious power disputes in the Western Hemisphere, and it's drawing renewed scrutiny from governments, analysts, and international observers. Venezuela's acting president has publicly stated that Nicolás Maduro remains the country's legitimate president. On its face, that statement sounds definitive. But when placed against documented facts, international recognition, and Venezuela's own political reality, it quickly begins to unravel. Here's why this matters. Venezuela has been locked in a legitimacy crisis for years. Competing claims of authority, disputed elections, and international sanctions have left the country politically fractured and economically devastated. When senior officials make sweeping declarations about legitimacy, those statements are not just rhetorical. They affect diplomacy, sanctions enforcement, and the lives of millions of Venezuelans. According to recent interviews and reporting, the acting president's claim rests on the assertion that Maduro continues to exercise control over state institutions and therefore remains the lawful head of state. That argument leans heavily on de facto power, not broad democratic consent or international validation, and that distinction is critical. Control does not automatically equal legitimacy, especially in systems where elections are disputed, opposition figures are barred, and independent oversight is absent. That gap between power and legitimacy is exactly where Venezuela's crisis lives. Internationally, many governments have either withdrawn recognition from Maduro in the past or placed strict conditions on recognizing his authority. While some diplomatic positions have shifted over time, the core dispute has never been resolved. Whether Maduro's continued rule reflects the will of the Venezuelan people or the entrenchment of a regime protected by force and institutional capture. The acting president's statement attempts to close that debate with certainty, but certainty requires evidence, and that's where the claim runs into trouble. This is not about rhetoric or ideology. It's about standards, how legitimacy is defined, who gets to define it, and whether international norms still apply when power refuses to change hands. In this report, we are going to separate what is confirmed from what is asserted, examine why this claim is being made now, and explain why many analysts argue it does not hold up under scrutiny. Because in Venezuela, words matter, and so does who believes them. Here is what is confirmed based on established reporting, official records, and widely recognized international positions regarding Venezuela's leadership. Nicolás Maduro has remained in control of Venezuela's executive branch and state institutions since succeeding Hugo Chavez in 2013. He continues to exercise de facto authority over the military, national ministries, the state oil company, and key government bodies inside the country. That control, however, has long been separated from international consensus on legitimacy. Maduro's most recent presidential election was widely criticized by international observers and foreign governments. Major concerns cited included the exclusion or suppression of opposition candidates, lack of independent electoral oversight, and the absence of conditions considered necessary for a free and fair election. As a result, multiple democratic governments previously declined to recognize the outcome as legitimate. In response to those disputes, Venezuela entered a prolonged political standoff, with competing claims of authority and shifting recognition among foreign governments. Over time, some countries adjusted their diplomatic posture, choosing engagement over isolation. Others maintained sanctions and continued to question the legitimacy of Maduro's mandate. What is important and confirmed is that international recognition has never been uniform. There is no global consensus affirming Maduro's presidency as fully legitimate under democratic standards. Recognition has varied by country, by administration, and by strategic interest. It is also confirmed that Venezuela's judiciary, electoral authorities, and security forces remain aligned with Maduro's government. Independent checks on executive power are limited, and opposition parties have faced legal and political constraints. When senior officials within the government assert that Maduro remains legitimate, they are relying on institutional control and continuity, not on newly validated electoral legitimacy or renewed international endorsement. No new internationally recognized election has taken place to resolve the dispute conclusively. No independent global body has certified a recent vote meeting democratic benchmarks accepted by major international observers. So the factual baseline is this. Maduro maintains control of the state. Elections under his rule have been disputed. International recognition is fragmented. No conclusive resolution has occurred. Those facts define the reality, regardless of political statements. What they do not explain is why government leaders continue to frame legitimacy as settled, or why that framing is being challenged again now. The claim being made by Venezuela's acting president is straightforward, that Nicolás Maduro remains the country's legitimate leader because he holds power and governs the state. That argument is being presented as settled fact, but that framing collapses under closer examination. The reality is that legitimacy and control are not the same thing. A government can exercise authority without meeting democratic standards recognized by the international community. That distinction is central to Venezuela's crisis, and it's the part the acting president's statement avoids. The claim relies on a circular logic. Maduro is legitimate because he governs, and he governs because he is legitimate. That reasoning ignores how legitimacy is typically established, through elections that are competitive, transparent, independently observed, and accepted as credible by both domestic stakeholders and international monitors. Those conditions have not been met. While Maduro's government cites continuity and institutional alignment as proof of legitimacy, critics point to documented election irregularities, restricted opposition participation, and the absence of neutral oversight. International observer missions have either declined to validate results or were not permitted to operate under conditions considered credible. Another part of the claim suggests that international recognition has shifted decisively back toward Maduro. That is not accurate. Some governments have chosen engagement for pragmatic reasons, such as migration management or energy policy, but engagement is not endorsement. Diplomatic contact does not equal recognition of electoral legitimacy. The acting president's statement also overlooks the fact that legitimacy is not frozen in time. It must be renewed. Even leaders who once held recognized authority can lose legitimacy when electoral processes break down or constitutional norms erode. This is why analysts continue to describe Venezuela's leadership as disputed, not resolved. The claim that Maduro's legitimacy is beyond question does not align with international legal standards, democratic norms, or the historical record of how this standoff emerged. It reflects a political position, not a conclusion supported by independent validation. And that gap between assertion and reality is precisely why this issue continues to resurface. Which leads to the next question. Why is this claim being emphasized now, and who benefits from framing the dispute as settled? When a government insists that legitimacy is settled despite ongoing dispute, it's worth asking why that message is being amplified now, and who stands to gain from it. In Venezuela's case, asserting that Nicolás Maduro remains unquestionably legitimate serves several strategic purposes. First, it reframes the crisis as resolved rather than contested. That framing pressures foreign governments, international institutions, and even domestic critics to treat the status quo as permanent. Second, it shifts the burden of proof. Instead of the government having to demonstrate democratic legitimacy through transparent elections, critics are forced to justify continued skepticism. That inversion is powerful, especially when fatigue sets in after years of stalemate. Third, it consolidates internal authority. Public declarations of legitimacy signal to the military, courts, and state-run institutions that continuity is expected and dissent is futile. In systems where power depends on alignment rather than consent, messaging matters as much as law. Accountability, however, does not disappear because it is declared inconvenient. Legitimacy in democratic systems is not self-certified. It relies on renewal through processes that are competitive, observable, and accepted as credible. When those processes are absent or compromised, claims of legitimacy remain vulnerable, regardless of how often they are repeated. There is also an international dimension. Some governments have softened their posture toward Caracas for pragmatic reasons, migration flows, energy markets, or regional stability. But engagement does not erase past findings, nor does it retroactively validate disputed elections. That distinction is often blurred intentionally. By stating that Maduro's legitimacy is beyond debate, the acting president is attempting to close a question that remains open in law, diplomacy, and public perception. That effort reflects confidence in control, not resolution. Power can persist without legitimacy. History shows that clearly. But when legitimacy is asserted rather than earned, it becomes fragile, dependent on repetition instead of recognition. And that fragility explains why this issue keeps resurfacing. As we close, the core issue is not whether Nicolás Maduro still holds power. He does. The issue is whether power alone is enough to claim legitimacy. By democratic standards, it is not. Legitimacy is not declared by officials. It is earned through elections that are competitive, transparent, independently observed, and accepted as credible. That standard has not been met in Venezuela, and repeating the claim does not change the record. The acting president's statement is best understood as a political maneuver, not a factual resolution. It is an attempt to normalize a disputed reality, to turn endurance into validation, and to pressure both domestic critics and foreign governments into treating an unresolved crisis as settled. But unresolved crises don't disappear because they're inconvenient. Venezuela's leadership question remains contested because the conditions that created the dispute have never been corrected. Until there is a credible electoral process that meets international norms, claims of legitimacy will continue to face scrutiny, no matter how often they are asserted. This matters beyond Venezuela. It sets a precedent for how the world treats elections, accountability, and the difference between control and consent. This is the Grant Caldwell Report. We distinguish power from legitimacy. We separate assertion from evidence, and we follow the facts, not the declarations. If you want continued fact-driven coverage on global power shifts and accountability, like this video, subscribe and turn notifications on. We'll keep watching.